Good evening, everyone. Tarnonama. And very happy Thanksgiving to friends and family back in the US who are tuning in. I'd also like to send very best wishes to Claire Mitchell, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight. I'd like to thank the Secretariat for hosting this event, and many thanks to Secretary Conmoy, Robbie Hall, Niamh Kelpie, Catherine Murphy, and the rest of the team. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight in person and online for this very special event. I'm honored and delighted to chair this panel of distinguished speakers who will be discussing Northern Irish literature and culture in the context of the Decade of Centenaries. I'll keep my opening comments short, as I know that we're all very keen to hear what the panelists have to say about this topic. After the panel discussion, we're going to have an audience Q&A for the people in the room, followed by a reception with a chance for further conversation, as well as book signings and refreshments. The lovely folks from No Alibis Bookshop are here selling copies of the panelists' work, so be sure to have a look. And if you'd like to post about tonight's event on social media, please use the hashtag #PointsOfLight so that we can follow the online conversation. But we would ask that you please put your phones on vibrate or silent for the duration of the event. Now I will introduce each of our panelists, followed by my brief opening remarks on the theme of tonight's event, and then we'll get into the panel. Jan Carson is a writer and community arts facilitator based in Belfast. She has a novel, Malcolm Orange Disappears, and a short story collection, Children's Children, with Liberties Press, in addition to 2 microfiction collections, Postcard Stories 1 and 2, with Emma Press, as well as a short story collection, The Last Resort, and a novel, The Firestarters, with Doubleday. The Firestarters won the EU Prize for Literature for Ireland in 2019, the Kitschy's Prize for Speculative Fiction in 2020, and was shortlisted for the 2020 Dalkey Book Prize. Jan won the Harper's Bazaar Short Story Competition in 2016, and she's been shortlisted for the BBC National Short Story Prize and the Sean O'Toole Short Story Prize. Martin Doyle is books editor of the Irish Times, which he joined in 2007. He started his career in London in 1990 with the Irish World. He joined the Irish Post as a reporter in 1992 and rose to become editor before moving in 2001 to the Times. Martin edited A History of the Irish Post, which was published in 2000 to mark the newspaper's 30th anniversary. A native of Banbridge, County Down, he's a graduate of the University of St Andrews, where he studied French and German. Martin was an extra in Father Ted, and he is still dining out on it. His essay, Dirty Linen, is published in The 32, an anthology of Irish working class voices, edited by Paul McVeigh and published this year by Unbound. Stacey Gregg is a writer, director, and performer for stage and screen. Most recently, she directed a block of the television show The Baby for Sky and HBO. Stacey wrote and directed her debut feature film, Here Before, which premiered this year at South by Southwest Festival in America and here at the Belfast Film Festival, which it closed. She co-directed the play Inside Bitch for the Royal Court Theatre and Clean Break, and wrote and performed Hatchet Ginny at the Outburst Queer Arts Festival. Stacey's first full-length play, Perv, won a Stuart Parker Award, and her monologue Scorch won a Fringe First Award at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. Her plays are published by Nick Hearn Books in Bloomsbury, and her work has toured internationally. Stacey has written extensively for television, and she's currently developing her second feature film with BBC Films. Susan McKay is a journalist and author who has won many awards for her work. She's author of 4 critically acclaimed books, Sophia's Story, Northern Protestants, and Unsettled People, Without Fear, A History of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, and Bear in Mind These Dead. Susan was the Northern editor of the Sunday Tribune, and she's made a number of radio and television documentaries, including The Daughter's Story, about the daughters of the murdered musician Fran O'Toole of the Miami Show Band. She was a founder of the Belfast Rape Crisis Centre, and from 2009 to 2012, she was CEO of the National Women's Council of Ireland. She's made several podcast series with survivors of the Northern Ireland conflicts for the Wave Trauma Centre. Susan's writing appears in the New Yorker, New York Times, London Review of Books, and Guardian Observer, and the Irish Times. And she contributes regularly to BBC and RTE. In 2019, she won a major individual artist award from the Arts Council of Northern Ireland for a book about borders, which will be published in 2022. Her latest book, Northern Protestants on Shifting Ground, was published this year by Blackstaff Press. Monica McWilliams represented the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition's negotiating team in the multi-party peace talks leading up to the Good Friday Agreement. She represented South Belfast in the first Northern Ireland Legislative Assembly and served as Chief Commissioner of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission from 2006 to 2011. Monica has also served in an oversight capacity for prison reform in Northern Ireland and currently serves on the Independent Reporting Commission on the Disbandment of Paramilitary Organisations. She's the former chair of Interpeace, and she is currently involved with Women in Syria on the negotiating committee in Geneva. Monica's memoir, Stand Up, Speak Out, My Life Working for Women's Rights, Peace and Equality in Northern Ireland and Beyond, was just published this month by Blackstaff Press. Matthew O'Toole is an SDLP politician, former civil servant and journalist who has served as an MLA for the Belfast South constituency in the Assembly since January 2020. Prior to serving as an MLA, he worked as a journalist and a civil servant at Her Majesty's Treasury and 10 Downing Street. Matthew worked on the 2016 EU referendum and its aftermath. On leaving the civil service, he wrote widely on Brexit, its impact on Northern Ireland, and British-Irish relations. Matthew's writing has appeared in the Irish Times, The Guardian, Financial Times, Politico, New Statesman, and Irish Pages. Born in Belfast, Matthew grew up in Downpatrick and later read for an MA in International Relations at the University of St Andrews. And last but not least, Margaret Ward is an honorary senior lecturer in history at Queen's University Belfast. She's a feminist historian and contributor to the Decade of Centenaries through her many publications and lectures. Her books include Fearless Woman, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, Feminism, and the Irish Revolution, published by UCD Press in 2019. Her pioneering work, Unmanageable Revolutionaries, Women in Irish Nationalism, first published in 1983, has just been republished this month by Ireland House in an updated and revised edition covering the years 1880 to 1980. The 100th anniversaries of partition and Northern Ireland's foundation are notably contentious moments in the Decade of Centenaries. The question of how to address these particular occasions has divided public opinion sharply, especially amid the uncertainties of Brexit. How do we engage with difficult histories in such a way that respects everyone involved? I would propose that refracting difficult histories through the lens of literature and culture creates a space for meaningful dialogue and debate. Accordingly, when I discussed this event with the Secretariat, I suggested the title Points of Light. It's a phrase from Belfast-born writer Anna Burns' 2018 novel Milkman, an extraordinary work of art that engages with the long history of conflict in this region. Milkman is exceptional because it is the first novel by an author from Northern Ireland to win the Booker Prize, and because Anna Burns uses language that is dazzlingly new and inventive to address old, long-standing historical conflicts. In a powerful scene of self-revelation, the young woman narrator considers the need for people in the North to reflect on the positive aspects of their current and historical experiences. She posits, quote, "What if we accept these points of light, their translucence, their brightness? What if we let ourselves enjoy this, stop fearing it, get used to it? What if we come to believe in it, to expect it, to be impressed upon by it?" Correspondingly, the phrase points of light resonates deeply with the theme of this event, which is an exploration of how Northern literature and culture have served as points of light throughout our often fraught history and into our contested present. It is fitting to have this important conversation in the space of the Secretariat, a body created by the Good Friday Agreement. Secretary Conmay has made a tremendous effort to broaden awareness of Northern literature and culture, and thereby to broaden awareness of our shared artistic heritage. It is an exceptionally rich inheritance, one which far outweighs the small size of this place. And despite many contemporary challenges, Northern cultural production has never been more abundant, thriving, or globally successful than it is right now. Furthermore, as the past year and a half of pandemic-induced isolation has shown, literature and culture are absolutely vital to our sense of well-being, particularly in dark times. There's been a general hesitancy, particularly here in the North, to discuss certain aspects of the decade of commemorations, such as the Northern Ireland Centenary and Partition, due to the difficulty of the historical and contemporary questions surrounding it. But this is precisely the reason why we should talk about it, because it is difficult. If these difficult conversations never take place, if 100 years on from a disputed historical period, such issues are merely dusted under the rug, we will only perpetuate the code of silence and erasure that has stifled Northern society historically. So I propose that we follow the example of Northern authors who boldly engage with challenging issues in their writing in ways that are empathetic, enriching, and enlightening. Through their remarkable storytelling, Northern writers present radiant points of light that impress upon us indelibly, guiding us to a deeper understanding, not only of our current and past circumstances, but also of ourselves. Thank you. So I wanted to start off with a couple of points from Claire Mitchell because I felt so badly that she couldn't be here tonight, and I wanted to make sure that she was included. So these are just general points of discussion that anybody can jump in on, and this is a very loose, informal, in-conversation style discussion. So if you want to say anything or add on to somebody's point, just indicate, and we'll go with that. So one of the things that Claire and I corresponded about was in one of her pieces, she wrote that after partition, people started to define as one thing or the other, a pattern which continues into the present day. And it got us thinking about the fact that partition was not just one event, it was a process. And in many ways, that process is still continuing. But also the process of the formation of the Northern Irish state is something that is still continuing, depending on how you look at it from different perspectives. These are things that are happening still every day. So I was wondering what you think about this, when we think about this in terms of a process. I mean, we're looking at the Decade of Centenaries. These aren't just like moments that were set in histories. These are things that are still affecting our everyday lives. And there hasn't been much discussion about these particular anniversaries. So I was wondering if anybody wanted to kind of jump in, a brave soul.
One thing that struck me just very recently, talking to my colleague Ronan Greavy at the Irish Times, this is an anniversary that hasn't actually come up yet, but it's the anniversary of the Boundary Commission, which actually was almost as important as partition in that the understanding was that it was going to redraw the boundary of Northern Ireland to make it more in the way of plebiscites which were happening all over Europe post First World War, to make the boundary more contiguous with the wishes of the population at a kind of a local level. Mm-hmm. For example, South Armagh, Derry City, Fermanagh and Tyrone, had nationalist majorities, and if you were following the principle of, drawing a line so that north of the line would be an area that had a clear Protestant majority and had a Unionist majority, British majority, whatever you want to call it, that would have had a certain logic, if you like, and because that didn't happen, I think that had dramatic effects for, arguably partition might have been more effective and longer lasting in a historical perspective if that had happened, and it didn't happen. So I think that's something that hasn't really been explored much, and is an interesting thing to follow up.
I think also part of that is, I went to a book launch of a book, Ulster Political Lives, a number of years ago, and the late Maurice Hayes then talked about what he called the second flight of the Earls, that Northern Ireland, or what became Northern Ireland, lost so many Catholics, particularly middle-class Catholics or people who would have given leadership, who left the north for various reasons. And when one looks now at for example, the military service pensions and people there talking about what their service had been, so many people are doing it from Dublin, or there are others who are in America or whatever. People didn't stay, and even people who wanted to stay, I think were forced out. You know, people, I know one woman who had been Tyrone's first rate collector, but when the Oath of Allegiance got imposed, she wasn't going to stay as a Republican, and leaves and becomes the city librarian, the first city librarian for Dublin. So we lost people, and it's really only in the 1960s when we're talking about the education reforms, etc., and a new middle-class leadership coming up. But we've got this kind of wasteland in the middle of people who are traumatized, who are left, and the ones who are putting in applications for service pensions are all still saying things like, I'm still victimized, people having to keep their heads down. Some people who put in applications because they were doing it to Portobello Barracks in Dublin, then got arrested because of, you know, what they were doing, because the Northern authorities then knew that they had been active Republicans. You know, so there's all of that trauma that I think is still only very painfully surfacing now in terms of the Northern experience.
I also discovered, when I was doing the research for my book, things about my family that I didn't know from that period, because there was a kind of silence around it, that obviously the term the Troubles was coined in 1921 by the Irish newspaper. I thought it was the Troubles was coined by our Troubles. And when I saw that, I realised that there was a kind of a silence about the trauma. And when you compare that to other conflicts, how people are worried about talking about what their relatives did. And I discovered that on my mother's side, and she was McKenna from the Spurn Mountains in Mahara, and the house that I used to sit in as a child looking after my grandfather, you know that tradition where one grandchild is sent up to look after Granny, who isn't well. Well, I was that child, and I was sent up to a house with no electricity, and I thought chamber pot was a very grand name for what I was using it for. And that was the house where Waddy Graham had been hidden in 1798 on his way to escape to America. And they were hiding him in 1798, and I traced that one of the many Uncle Father Johns that I had was 5 years old at the time. And so my granny tells me these stories, and I'm thinking, could that be true? And she points to how half the house was burned down when they discovered that Waddy Graham was hiding in it. And he was executed 5 days later, hung in Mahara. And I didn't know any of that. Until I started working on this, and I remembered my granny telling me and thinking, why isn't this written? Why didn't I know? But then what I didn't also know, but should have, was that my mother's first cousin was the commander for the IRA in South Derry, and Michael Collins came up and took him at the time of the pogroms, and I see there's a whole lot being written about whether it should be called a pogrom or not, and he figured they were going to get wiped out, and took him and his brother, and he became the general of the Irish Army, General Dan McKenna. Well, how did I not know that my cousin was the general? And they didn't talk about it. I think it was because they were concerned that, and every generation I discovered, every generation, every decade after that, there was trouble. And there was trouble in the 30s with relatives being in the ship in Strangford Lough, and escaping and swimming, again a relative, and taken to Derry and locked up there in the riots, and because they were locked up in a prison that they had to break the bottled glass of the windows. So talk about a process.
Yeah.
It was decade after decade after decade, and it brought me right up to the present. And you can imagine, when I entered the peace talks, it was discovered I was a cousin of Charlie Haughey's. So you can imagine how well that went down. And I saw David Irvine from the Progressive Unionist Party passed me the wee notes to say, you better watch out, the word's out about you. So there you go. So there is a process. Yeah. Our troubles were never an event. Yeah. And they're not ended.
And you mentioned 1798, and speaking of commemorations, that there's an anniversary for that coming up in 2 years' time, and that's something that hasn't been talked about as much still, either in an official kind of capacity. So that's something that actually Claire Mitchell's book is on, that will be coming out. She's called The Ghost Limb, Searching for the Spirit of 1798. And she talks about it in terms of cultural disrememberings, which I thought was a really useful term. And she says that, for her, this sense of radical Protestant heritage that she has in her family line is something that she feels some sense of connection to, but she says it's like a ghost limb. And I thought, well, obviously we think about that term a lot when we think in terms of conflict and war, that, this is something that kind of resulted from that. And she says, by connecting with these cultural disrememberings, that, this is a way of kind of getting in touch with that ghost limb. And she says, gently pulling back the undergrowth of our broken northern politics. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that northern political divisions and cultural disrememberings have overshadowed our current decade of centenaries?
I think, dive in slightly, root to that tentative thing where you start to make a noise and you hope you're not talking across anyone. First of all, thank you for putting this event together. Given that I'm the only serving politician, designated nationalist politician in Northern Ireland Assembly, I have to be very careful to look like I'm not enjoying this event, because it's about tech. So if I look like I'm smiling too much, please someone restrain me lest I get in trouble. Not to be flippant. I think what the quote you just read out from Claire kind of reinforced something I was thinking about as I was listening to Monica and Margaret and Martin talk there, which is about the kind of theme of the event you put together is the culture and literature in the context of the centenaries, and the general observation, it's not even an observation, it's a really strong sense I've had since I became a politician, is, I guess, the feeling of being when you're a politician. Well, Monica's someone who, to be fair to her, always tried to broaden the ground when she was in politics, but is the sense of the narrow ground that you're on. Even when you're a centre ground party, the grammar of politics here is still pretty, you're still kind of operating at times on a window ledge in terms of getting caught out. I won't bore everyone with the Heaney quote from whatever you say nothing. But there is a degree to which being in politics here is about inhibiting your speech, when often what we should be doing with our politics here is whatever our view about the issues of the day, or indeed the constitutional question, reaching out and trying to find new ways of talking about the place we live in, the experience of being from here, and the trauma of being from here at times. And when writing, it's like and there are several examples in this room of people who have played a huge role in terms of putting words on a page that have helped people understand and access new ways of understanding this place, and brought solace and joy to understanding that. Unfortunately, I think that the constant challenge of being a politician here is that is finding the space to use language in ways that are imaginative and help people understand and access new ways of thinking about the place, because you do get forced into kind of watching, as all politicians do, but particularly here. I found myself, one of the things I kind of came into politics through writing, because I left a career in the civil service because I was extremely annoyed basically about what was happening in relation to Brexit, and wanted to write about it. I started my career as a journalist, and I kind of wrote a lot about Brexit and here and what it meant and what I thought it meant and all those things. And I found it, in a sense, at times much easier to say things that were risky and but potentially useful than sometimes I do as a politician. It can feel quite, the narrow ground can feel quite prohibitive. But I have a beer next to me, so maybe if I keep drinking and my tongue will listen.
Yeah, can I jump in?
Yeah.
Because I actually have something to say, and I don't know if I will later on. First of all, can I just say I feel like a complete fraud because I didn't know what any of the things in the Decade of Centenaries were until about 10 years ago. I grew up in a Protestant grammar school in Ballymena where they didn't teach us any Irish history at all. And I often say jokingly, like I thought the Easter Rising was another name for Christ's resurrection until about 12 years ago. So I feel quite out of my depth tonight, but I love what Matthew said about kind of language, and I can speak to that. And about 10 years ago, I did a completely useless master's degree in Bob Dylan, which is very, very fun, but it's particularly bizarre because the topic was theology, but it was a comparative study between Jesus' use of metaphor and parable and allegory, in comparison to how Dylan used that in his early kind of records, where they were quite cryptic, but he had a kind of an agenda. He was talking a lot about, civil rights and those kind of things. And one of the things that I realised is when you use allegory and metaphor and language that's kind of nuanced and open to interpretation, it gives a lot of value to the listener or the reader, because you're saying, actually, do you know what? I think you are intelligent enough and of value enough to be able to make up your own mind about what these words mean. And I sometimes feel in the political realms in Northern Ireland that is missing. So the way politicians use language, or perhaps as Matthew is saying, are forced to use language here, it's quite patronising sometimes. It's like, I'm telling you what to think, not inviting you into a conversation to discover what you might want to think about this. And I guess over the last few years, I've realised that changing hearts and minds is a journey. You don't tell people what you're thinking is wrong, you should be thinking like this, and they change like that. You have to invite them into a conversation about it, and perhaps that's where artistic language maybe can do something that political rhetoric isn't doing at the minute. That's probably the only thing I'm going to say tonight.
Well, I mean,
could I just
yeah,
say some quote Jan to herself, actually, because she said something to me in her interview for my book, which is completely about what you just said.
This is like, you're not like being a politician, Jan.
She said, she said, I don't want to lambast people, but I would love to start a respectful dialogue about how we can maybe become less intolerant, less tight. For me, unleashing imagination is an act of protest. Just giving people stories that invite them in is actually an act of rebellion. So I think that's following on well from what you're saying. And I think my feeling is that Lyra McKay is a very, very important person to this generation, because she didn't survive. I mean, it's so poignant that she wrote about hope and about, that things were going to get better. And she did that not very long before she was herself killed. But she was killed by people who were trying to throw everybody back into a past of aspiration towards something that people have moved on from aspiring to, and I always feel that when I think about when she was standing watching that riot that night, she will have been looking at those boys and thinking, you're throwing your lives away in the service of an old, bitter dream that's over, So I think about that, and I think that she galvanised an awful lot of young people of this generation, because it was such a shock to them to lose somebody of their own age, And but contrasted with that, then you have, 2 years later, the Secretary of State coming in and saying, right, we're going to abandon looking at the history of the conflict. We're no longer going to do history. That's over and done with. It's only causing trouble. We'll just leave it where it is, So I think that you can't do that. And I think that in some ways Lyra has become a kind of touchstone for a lot of people in terms of honouring her memory, because she was specifically exploring the way in which the conflict here over the last 40 years or more overshadowed the lives of her generation. So her struggle with history is the one that people are honouring, rather than the notion that we can just sweep it all under the carpet and let all the people who have been fighting for the truth for 50 years just forget about it, you know, which isn't going to happen.
Yeah.
But I've recently been reading J.G. Farrell's The Troubles again, which came out in, I think, 1920 or 21. Yeah. But
it was set there, it became a bit set.
yeah, but I mean, it's just, yes, it's about that period, sorry. But it's incredible the way that he brings in the generation of people who had lived through the First World War, and he talks about looking at certain people, this Major Archer, who's kind of the narrator in a way. He notices the eyes of people who have lived through trauma, and he notices how they're not speaking, that other people are sort of being full of gaiety and chatting and making fun of things and not caring about the future. And then he notices that there's somebody who's silent, and he recognizes this lost look of somebody who was traumatized in some way by being in the First World War. You know, and so, like, people in this country have lived through so many conflicts. You know, people of every generation in this country have lived through so many conflicts that then younger people don't really know about, you know.
I was thinking the other day, actually, that when I was at school in the north, like, we did the First World War poets, you know, Wilfred Owen and Sassoon, and I wonder, you know, 30 years on, are young people's now, you know, reading Pádraic Fake or some of the Seamus Heaney poems, for example, that address, you know, the violence that happened on our own doorsteps. Like, if there are lessons to be learned about the futility of war from Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, you know, are there lessons being taught to, you know, to my children's generation in the North today based on the writing of Pádraic Fake or Heaney? Like, strikingly in your book, Susan, Bear in Mind He's Dead, it's, you know, it's studded with quotations from northern writers like Hewitt and Heaney and so forth, and they really do sort of, you know, refract and reflect light back on some of the terrible things that happened, and somehow it's, you know, it has a redemptive quality, whatever. It kind of raises up some of the terrible facts to another level where they can be kind of understood or, I don't know, dwelt on, maybe less painfully somehow.
I think that's a really good question. I think actually the English literature teachers, and if there's any teachers in the room, and I see Grania Tobin down there who would maybe answer this question, about what they're teaching in terms of poetry and arts, because I think they're doing that a whole lot better than what they're doing in politics. Because Mark Durkin told me recently that his 15-year-old daughter is doing her O-levels, and the only mention of John Hume in it was the row in his party about talking to Gerry Adams. Now, if that's what's being taught in history and politics, and then the question was, why did the SDLP fall out with John Hume? That's the question to the kids at 15 about our politics. So I'd love to see the curriculum. I'd love to see what they're doing. So I don't know if there's teachers in the room that could answer it. I know that it's always been a huge difficulty here, and they shied away from it, hence the reason why we got the Spanish Armada and all that stuff. And today there's a thing I'm working with called Politics in Action in Schools, because of the segregated nature of our stupid education system. Instead of having kids educated together, Peter Veal, who was a journalist in the BBC, started up this wee project, and we've now about 40 schools involved in the toughest areas. And probably, Matthew, you've addressed some of these kids, because
I think I'm going to,
yeah, and I think it's brilliant. And the kids are taking it themselves. They're 5th and 6th formers. And the reason why is because the politics teachers are frightened about what the parents might say if they teach politics in the classroom.
Yeah.
So where's that 100 years on in terms of centenary? So that's a very good question. So to those of you who write and work in the arts, brilliant. To people like Margaret and historians here, how much harder it is to get your works into the politics classes, and for the politics teachers to feel comfortable about teaching about Irish nationalism and unionism and our current state of affairs.
Guy Biner, who has written a fantastic book on 1798 and the sort of cultural disremembering and the difficulties that we've had here in the North, particularly in the Protestant community, in remembering what 1798 was really about, gave a fantastic talk the other day on cultural remembering and partition. And one of the points he made was that there is very little in terms of literature and partition. He said if you think of the partition of other countries, of Palestine or India, Pakistan, etc., there's loads that people have written about their own personal memories, or they've put it into fiction, so many writers. But when you come to here, we still don't have that. And maybe this is something throwing out to the literary side of our panel, you know, that there really is very, very little that we're still at that cultural non-remembering or not wanting to talk about it. If you think about the literature of the times.
Yeah, like I'd say, you know, it can't be a prescriptive thing. Like, you know, fiction writers, you know, obviously I'll defer to Jan, who can speak for herself, but, you know, my understanding is that, you know, they write what they want to write about. I thought it was interesting, like, say, Bernard McClaverty's latest collection, you know, he was writing about, you know, a sectarian event that happened, interestingly, the year of his birth, which I think was 1942, and he wrote about a clash between like a British Army incursion into a family home in Belfast, which happened to be, you know, based on his own family history, cricket ball and all. But I guess, you know, for a writer to take on the original troubles of around partition in Belfast now, it'll be a historical novel. They wouldn't be writing, you know, from their own personal experience.
No, but what he was talking about, people at the time didn't write about it. That's what he's saying.
Can I jump in? Because I think, and I see Rosemary as well, and I know Rosemary's talked about this too. Like, one of the really lovely things about the Decade of Centenaries has been how much work it has thrown our way. A lot of us have been dining out on the Decade of Centenaries for a good wee while now, but it has. Like, I totally agree with Martin that, you know, writers will write about what they want to write about, but sometimes centenaries like this, if they're handled the right way, maybe force us to look creatively at things we wouldn't naturally have been drawn to. I'm probably done with writing about the border at this point, but it has been a lovely excuse to go and do research and learn things I didn't know before. And
I think I actually commissioned you to write a story loosely around
the
centenary.
That one about the flags.
Yeah.
Well, I want to bring Stacey in on this discussion as well. Well, I mean, speaking of borders, like, I mean, I loved your short film, Your Ma's Hard Brexit. It was just brilliant. If you haven't seen it, you have to look it up. For these Guardian short films that were commissioned. And I found an interesting quote in Susan's book that you said, Stacey, that I wanted to ask you about. And you said, I've never stopped trying to write about my Northern Irishness. You can't grow up here and not be political. I'm very aware that Protestants don't get a good rap. I feel uneasy when people mock working class Protestants. It shows a poverty of empathy. There's a flavour of condescension. I find value in being from a people who are seen as the oppressor in the relationship. It's uncomfortable, and I feel it's a moral duty to understand that discomfort. So I wanted to ask about, I mean, it's a slightly uncomfortable question, but how have you explored that in your writing, and was this just something that kind of came out, or was this like a conscious decision to explore that?
The short film, or from
well, just, you know, more broadly.
in general.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of two-sided. There's the sort of explicit side, which is that it felt like such an upheaval to decide to leave home, and it felt like such a big part of who I was, and I felt unable or I didn't know how to process it through work or conversation or otherwise, so I felt really lost for a long time. And I was trying to make work about Northern Ireland. Essentially, it seemed to people who didn't really care, which, because I was in England, London, for quite a lot of that time. And so it was, in some ways, that blank canvas was quite useful. And your Ma's a hard Brexit is a really good example of that, because it never failed to surprise me how little people knew, and the fact that went quite international in terms of the how it seemed to resonate with people. And it was a very basic, very simple, quite domestic setup of a mother and a son walking along the peace line, and talking to camera. But it's amazing how things like that can travel. And I think that, you have pieces like representations of Northern Ireland and Northern Irish Protestants in particular are very thin, I would say, in general, and it's quite an easy target. And I think sometimes that's to do with the paucity of understanding outside of this place. So some of the work that travels to Europe, or especially to America, there's room for many more voices, I would say, diplomatically. But I made it. I worked on a very small piece recently that wasn't explicitly about the Decade of Centenaries, but it came up as part of a royal court, the Living newspaper they were doing during the lockdown, and it was a way to employ and keep writers writing, basically. I worked on a small piece with Amanda Coogan, who is the ISL signer for the Assembly. And, it was only a 5-minute piece, but I'm just giving an example of how art does exactly what you were talking about. You get the freedom, and specifically we were looking at language and how Northern Ireland is signed in ISL and BSL. And we discovered that there are all sorts of informal ways that are very commonly used that are actually quite offensive. So flicking the shamrock is one, flicking the shamrock out of Ireland, or potato pickers. These are like very commonly used signs in BSL. So we put together a little piece to improvise this, and the whole piece imploded because our BSL signer was worried that it was unethical and got in touch just before we were going to rehearse. But of course, the whole rehearsal was about the fact that it's quite offensive. So we couldn't actually rehearse the piece. So we ended up making a piece about how it was impossible to make the piece about Northern Ireland. And again, it's that thing about language just being multifaceted and constantly moving. And I guess, to come back round to the question you asked me, is I find myself more now seeking to celebrate that. Sounds quite perverse, but I think I've got to the point now where it's more useful to crack open those conversations. And when you talk about language feeling like an invitation, people are actually quite afraid of invitations, I find, a lot of the time. And so finding a way to hold that discomfort feels like part of the responsibility of making work around identity here. And that's been I think, part of the journey that I've had in terms of making art.
Do you think Northern Irish people are particularly cautious about the invitation thing? Because I think there's a big thing even there in how people react to art in general here, that they're a bit terrified by it, a lot of folks. Not us, like us people up here, we're grand with it. But,
Well, I think people it feels exposing, and even when you were talking about people not writing about their own experiences, I remembered the last time we were here and Claire Mitchell was talking about there's still a real unease about exposing yourself or your family, or still feels too close and too small. And I think again that speaks to, Lyra's experience.
Of course, that's the experience I had when I sat down to write the book.
It's terrifying.
I said I need to buy a one-way ticket out of the country when this is published, and I still do. If any of you can find a country that would take me, because it was, you were exposing yourself. Yeah. You were telling stories that had never been told, and by the time the third lawyer got through it, a lot was on the cutting floor, because if they're still alive, you can't tell them. And you shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but I'm afraid I do. And those stories never were really told by what you felt like to be on the receiving end. So I do say what it felt like to be on the receiving end. But I also was exposing myself in the sense that I thought, well, now what's going to happen? The book's only out, so I'll wait and find out. But you know, Margaret, that also might be the reason, and that a lot of people were frightened about what would happen to their relatives. And I had to be very careful. I wrote to every single person that I thought, could they live with this? I'm putting this in. I wrote to quite a few politicians as well, whose stories hadn't been told, but I had been there and witnessed them. And some said, yes, go ahead. And one or two said, well, the first story's fine, but I'm not so happy about the second one. So you have to be careful about that too, because you're writing about your engagement with other people. And you're also talking about your family, and who are living in small rural areas where everybody knows everybody, who have already had pretty bad experiences of being bombed and shot at, and do not want that to happen to them again. I mean, you wrote about Barney O'Dowd, who I know, because Mary O'Dowd was a friend of mine, and we'd gone on holidays, and it was a terrible tragedy, where Barney lost his sons and his brother. And he talked about he had been driven at you. And I thought, that was a really powerful expression. But Barney had to get up and leave, because they didn't feel comfortable about staying there, about what might happen to the rest of the family.
Yeah, like I'm writing a bit more about that since writing that piece. I met Barney, who's still alive at 98, remarkably, and his son Noel, and I spoke to Mary on the phone. She lives in Newcastle. And not only did they leave the north, but I think hugely poignantly, you know, after their mother died, the brothers came back and exhumed the two brothers who had been murdered and brought them down south and reburied them in Meath, where they live now, which is kind of, you know, beside their mother, which, you know, is hugely poignant in terms of, you know, a hugely symbolic way of sort of saying the trauma that passes down a generation. It never ends, you know. Like as somebody said in another context, the bullet that killed their relative never stopped traveling. You know, it is still, you know, taking its toll. And I remember talking to Mary on the phone, and, you know, I'm not speaking out of school because, you know, she knew she was being recorded, but she was saying, you know, I hate the North, you know. And that's not saying I hate one side or the other. She hated the whole thing, the whole place, which, you know, I think a lot of people, you know, left the North feeling, you know, they could never live there again. And, you know, that's a story that has to be, you know, told and addressed. Like I remember Noel, Barney's son, saying, you know, people passed remarks about them leaving the North and, you know, they should have stayed and stuck it out or whatever. But, you know, they were stopped at an illegal loyalist checkpoint a few months after the murders, and the mother was traumatised. Nothing happened, but that was the last straw. And they left for good. And I went back with Noel and, you know, visited the house, which, you know, has been abandoned since 1976. And the walls, you know, the windows, the picture window in the sort of modern extension that had just been built the year before is blocked up, like its eyes have been put out sort of thing. And like, to me, it's not alone. Like there's several properties, there's many properties like that throughout Northern Ireland, and it's like Northern Ireland's own ghost estate of, you know, abandoned hopes and dreams, and it's a huge toll, and it's a story that I don't think has been fully told, because there was a time in the North during the Troubles when the deaths and the murders were coming so thick and fast, you know, in 1 year more than one a day. How could those individual traumas and atrocities be properly kind of reflected on? Sometimes there were news and briefs because, you know, as happened with the O'Dowds and the Reeves, you know, 6 people were murdered, and the next night 10 Protestants were murdered in Kingsmill, and the news cycle ground on, and people's lives lost but forgotten. And that's why I kind of think it's, you know, it's hugely important to go back and tell those stories and to reflect and try and learn something, if possible, from those awful things that happened.
Well, I think it's compulsory reading Susan's book. Bear in mind he's dead. I think everybody in this country should be given a copy. and hand it down.
Spare ones. Because hardly anybody bought it.
Susan, I wanted to ask you about the impetus for your latest book, and I mean, it's been 20-something years since kind of the first iteration of Northern Protestants. So what prompted you to want to kind of revisit this topic? And also, I wanted to, second part of that question would be, you've included a lot of writers here, and I wanted to hear more about, you know, why you decided to do that and what their perspectives kind of, how they shed light.
People had been saying to me that I should write a second version of this book, because this one came out just after the Good Friday Agreement, and with the centenary of Northern Ireland coming up and Brexit and the fact that for the first time there wasn't a unionist majority at Stormont, the fact that there's a census coming out that will probably show, you know, that Protestants are now only in a majority in the older age groups, you know, all of those things just seemed like a very interesting moment to come back and revisit the subject. But while I was writing the book, I must say I did feel a bit uneasy at times, because I almost felt as if I was being sectarian. I did feel at times I was being sectarian. Like, I was talking to this really interesting trade unionist, and I really wanted to interview her and everything, and then she said, you do know I'm a Catholic, don't you? And I had to sort of immediately start this, well, actually, it's fine. Do you know what? I don't think I'll bother calling you next week. Sure, I'll see you sometime. And it just felt really wrong. But also I found that more and more now there is a new liberation around. I mean, you know, I think what Martin and Monica are talking about is very sad and very true about the past, but I also don't think that the past should be the sole preoccupation, because there's generations now who didn't experience that history, and while they should respect it, they've also got their own life with their own problems and their own futures to think of that don't include those kind of things, and which include preoccupations with global sort of issues, you know. So I think that it's good to remember, but it can't be the only thing, because otherwise young people are just going to drown in the sorrows of our past. But when I was doing the first Northern Protestants book, I kind of wanted to reflect very much the political communities, you know. But with this one, I just decided I was going to go after people who are a bit different as much as people who are representative of broad swathes of political thinking. So I deliberately hunted out women. I didn't have to hunt out women. Women are more than 50% of the population, but you know, you would think that was not the case from the way that women get so little representation. You know, even journalists from the Republic who come up here to interview people, they just talk to men. It's ridiculous, it's unbelievable. And you know, you would think that women refuse to talk, but they don't. Women do talk. The other thing I found was that people talk much more freely now. People talk about being in mixed relationships. They talk about their parents not having been married. They talk about all kinds of things that people were much more uptight about 21 years ago when I did the first book. So in a way, in this book, I was looking for signs of I remember talking to David Irvine between the books, because I did a second issue of the first book about 2005, and I remember David Irvine talking about feeling that there were green shoots of maturity growing, and I really liked that idea. And there are green shoots. There's lots of brilliant people, and I said it the last time I was speaking here as well, like there's so many great people. Monica was talking about people leaving. There's so many brilliant people coming back. Like, you know,
have a few of them here.
These two people on my right have both come back. You've come here, you're doing a lot about promoting the notion of Northern Ireland as an interesting and vibrant place. Jan has gone back to her community by going to East Belfast, and
I lived away for 5 years as well.
Yeah, but you've written a lot about deciding to go back and talking about going back to bonfires and things, just to see what your attitude to the culture of your own people is, and things that you might have thought you had left behind as something that you understood in a particular way. You know, like people have come back, and people have come here who didn't come from here. Like, you've brought your wife here, haven't you? And you've brought your wife here. Maybe she came from here, did she? But you brought your wife to Northern Ireland. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, people wouldn't have done that.
I know.
You know, their relatives would have just thought, no way are you bringing our daughter here with you. You can just forget about that.
My friend,
you know.
my granda calls her, my friend.
Your friend, yes. Your wee friend, I hope.
Friend.
Your wee friend.
Yeah. Does she like it here though, does she?
But it's the vibrancy that's there and the life, and that was, Claire wrote a nice review of the book in which she said it was vital, and I like that word, you know, that sense that I think there's a lot of life in this book, and I think there's a lot of life in Northern Ireland, and it's new and it's different, and it's not necessarily preoccupied with the national question. And again, that's something that Lyra identified when she wrote about, I don't want a new Ireland, I don't want a United Ireland, I don't want a United Kingdom, I just want a decent life, you know.
I was just going to jump in as well and just talk a little bit more again about how representation matters in terms of visual representation, in terms of how we see ourselves on TV or in film and what's being produced about here and from here. There's a dancer, an artist called Una Doherty. I don't know how many people are familiar with her work, but she's astounding, and she's based here and has travelled internationally, and she made a piece called The Belfast Prayer. And I saw it in a few places, but I saw it at the South Bank Centre in London, and it was so engaged with the Belfast that you're describing, but also genuinely felt like such a piece of beauty. And she said herself that she wanted to sort of transcend that, but the piece ended so impactfully with this piece with a part called the Sugar Army, and she would train local girls, and they would be really tough girls, you know, with loads of energy, and there was just something defiant, very working class, still quite gnarly and twisted. You know, the soundtrack to it at times was quite disturbing and upsetting, you know. So she wasn't shying away from anything, but I just felt like there was an alchemy at work that felt really new and really progressive, but also very much connected to everything that you're describing and not shying away from the trauma. But yeah, I think that work.
I do think that women are breaking through. I mean, today I was driving through Derry, and I've never liked that statue, the peace statue at the end of the bridge there, but I was looking at it today and thinking, why does it have to be two fucking men? Why couldn't it have been two women? This is a city in which women were the workers, you know, the shirt factories were the mainstay of the city. There's no statue of women. There was supposed to be going to be a statue of a sewing machine that was made by a woman who made the sculpture that's outside the Europa, the one of the working women. Louise Walsh, yeah. And it never got put up, you know.
I think there's a sculpture of two women holding a linen cloth in Lurgan.
Well, Lurgan's all very well. Derry is Derry, you know, and that statue has been used in so many films about Northern Ireland, and it's men, you know, and why isn't it women?
Yeah. But one of the things about your book and your research, as well is bringing sexual politics into the whole scenario, and how important women have been. I mean, we've always been there. The women's movement has been there, bubbling away. I mean, you were involved in setting up Rape Crisis, Monica, Women's Aid. But now, and working class women having set up all these women's centres all over the north. I mean, the importance of what women have been doing unrecognised for decades. I mean, when Mary Robinson became president, the first thing she did, I mean, the first Irish president across the border, and where did she go? But to a women's centre in a Protestant working class area in Windsor. I mean, women have been so important, but now we can see north and south with the repeal movement for the 8th, for abortion rights, north and south, etc. How all that, and of course the mother and baby homes, but just that, you know, growing up, we all had this deadening religious conformity. I remember when I first came here, I was 13, and I could not believe that the swings and the playgrounds were all tied up on a Sunday. I'd come from a very Catholic country, and it was all so different on a Sunday. And then you came to this absolutely desperate place where you couldn't even buy a birthday card on a Sunday, because it was a Sunday. You could buy a newspaper, the man said, but you couldn't buy the birthday card because they couldn't sell that because it was Sunday. And just this horrible, horrible place. And women have been so important at chipping away at patriarchy and clerical control
And we've now had this explosion of Northern women's writing as well, which is just
Part
been
of it,
so
absolutely.
important. And something that struck me when I was thinking about kind of connections between the panelists and Jan and Stacey's work, I think for both of you, something that jumps out at me is it's really future orientated. Like it's always very open-ended and participatory, and it's inviting the viewer or the reader into it. And I was wondering, you know, do you feel like, is this kind of a conscious thing that you were deciding to do to kind of invite them in? And do you think that like Northern literature has a place in forging a new future, in, you know, by inviting people in, or Northern writing in general, I mean screenwriting as well, but do you think that it has a place in kind of shaping the future?
I hope so. I mean, I guess I'd just reiterate what I was saying, which is I'm very conscious of the impact that visual representation of ourselves can have, and everything that I was desperate to see when I was growing up, I want to put out there. So one of the reasons that I came back was I heard about Outburst Festival, and I was like, what? A queer festival in what? And so I wrote Scourge for Ruth, you know, and I was so excited to put something on here that might have changed my life when I was growing up, you know. That sounded really, I didn't mean it to come out like that, but you know what I mean. And for me, I think it might be a bit chicken and egg in terms of my identity and where I'm from, but I absolutely write in a way that invites conversation. So I actively resist telling. I always want to question or point at something together. And that's not for everyone, but it's definitely something that I will continue to do because I find great value in it, and I tend to shrink away from work that tells me. I'm quite anti-authoritarian, so I don't like being told. But I think that's very much to do with what I felt like I was resisting and running away from, and now I guess I'm trying to find a place here with that.
I love the term you used, which was transcend. And perhaps that's the question we should ask: how much have we transcended? And obviously in the book, that's what I was trying to address, going back to the time of standing up and speaking out. And that's the message I want to put across when Susan says you go back. Well, you go back to actually say, how did we get it so wrong, so that we put some of that right? And that's about transcending. But the hardest thing is attitudes.
Sorry, Monica.
No, go ahead.
When you were coming in today, when we met in the hall coming in, you were saying you'd just been at this Women's Aid event today where people were singing and singing their stories and things. Like, that is so amazing that would be done now, because it was so harsh back in the 1970s and 80s.
Today is 25th of November, which is the International Day of Violence Against Women. And it was a fantastic event, maybe because we're gathering and it was in person. But they had a choir, and they've got this term called experts by experience. And of course, I was asked to talk about my book and bringing it out in 1992, and how much had changed. And so much has changed, but there are still things that haven't, and decommissioning mindsets still has some way to go. But they were talking about, you know, the forced marriage of other countries. People put their noses up in terms of other cultures, and Noelle Collins was reminding us about women being forced to get married when they got pregnant and how much that has changed. But we were putting it all out there about what had changed, and we were looking at this new strategy, but it was a moment of euphoria when they invited the women who had the bravery and the courage of those who had got up and left, and were now singing their stories, and the joy of having left that behind them, and the empowerment and the choices that they had now got, which they wouldn't have had beforehand. So when you talk about process, that's definitely a process. Leaving is not an event, it's a process. Yeah. And I once said that to Tony Blair at the peace talks about our peace process. The next thing I heard him using it down in the Odyssey.
I was just informed something. Well, actually, a couple of people. Well, the last few people have talked about stories, and I think one of the things about we talked about the limits of political rhetoric, and one of the things that literature, as in published writing, whether it's fiction or any form of published writing, I guess other than kind of reported journalism, but any kind of published writing and personal stories of the kind Monica's talking about, or even personal stories that are shared in a context like this, or at a kitchen table, the kind of personal stories that Susan kind of curated in her book, stories people tell themselves in the pub or whatever. The advantage they have over rhetoric is that they're not stories told with a purpose. They're not told to proselytize or persuade of either a version of the past or a version of the future. And the famous, I think it's in, I can't remember what Heaney poem it's in, but the famous account that Heaney gives of being on a train, someone comes up and says, when are you going to write something for the cause? And he says, if I write something, it'll be for myself.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that all stories about this place are for the people themselves, like literally for the individual. So that there are, whenever Jan writes, I'm reading one of Jan's books, and there's nothing, Jan is a fiction writer who's writing about characters and developing them in the narrative, but no piece of either fiction writing or creative writing of any kind, in the same way that stories that individuals tell they're not impactful when they're told for the purposes of narrowly persuading someone of an account of the past or a version of the future. And I think that's extremely important, because you access kind of new understandings of this place and the people you live with, not when you're being persuaded of someone. Obviously, I say that as someone who's now professionally has to persuade people of things, but I'm aware of a lot of what I say is tedious and repetitive. It like really is, and I'm bored by it a lot of the time, but it's sort of by definition, that's what I find myself sort of waiting to go on particular radio programs, not one in particular, but I could sort of drop a fairly obvious hint there and sort of think, I know I will have to say these words in the certain order that I've said before. I have to sort of pitch how I'm going. That's not interesting. I mean, it's necessary. I'm not demeaning what I do, but that's different from the stories we need to tell one another, and writers need to be able to access. And the one other literary image that I think about, and I think it definitely is women fiction writers. Moved to two examples in the room who are telling stories now and writing books that are enabling us to access an understanding of our recent history and the Northern Ireland of now and more recent Irish history. But I always think of another female writer when I think of, sometimes when I'm in the assembly and the staidness of how we communicate to one another. There's a scene in The Last September, which is Elizabeth Bowen's book about the War of Independence, and famously the story, only you sort of hear these brief echoes of the war and the tumult that's happening. It's a little bit like Troubles, except it's not. It shares with Troubles the fact that it's about a stately home or a gentry or aristocracy context who are kind of trying to avoid the fact that this war's happening outside, although it's serious rather than comic. But there's a moment in which people are having, I think, dinner in a formal dining room, and there are two heavy oil paintings of ancestors on the walls, and Bowen sets out this thing, which is the two people who are opposite the table and attempting to talk to one another are kind of possessed by these pictures of ancestors on the walls behind them, and that's a little bit at times what it can feel like being a politician here. You're not in the assembly, yeah. You're aware. Yeah, you're aware that you're like, at times you're like, I'm representing a kind of oil painting behind an oil painting or a statue of some. No, I don't want to say tribal, because that's a simpler, but a tradition or something inherited, and that's not necessarily particularly useful when it comes to accessing information or understanding one another.
True.
Can I ask Matthew about, there was a day, I watch a lot of the assembly stuff, and there was a day that you were actually, there was a debate going on which would have made anybody despair, and at one point you were sort of sitting like this.
Oh, yeah.
With your head on your and
I thought, went viral, that image on Twitter.
Did you do that deliberately because you wanted to signal to people, I can't do this at all anymore, or did you just sink to
that was a reaction to what I was hearing, but it was not done with
the cameras in mind.
It was not done. It wasn't. I can't claim that I'm that sophisticated or Machiavellian a political communicator. It was, I think, it was a reaction to what I was hearing, and what I was hearing was Jim Alister effectively defend conversion therapy. And so I was reacting to what Jim was saying in revulsion, but I wasn't doing it. It was a natural rather than a setup.
And that's natural.
Okay, I think we should open up for audience questions now. So does anyone have a burning question that they'd like to ask one of the panelists or the panel in general? Just indicate.
Make it even more attractive.
Yeah.
Stand up, speak out.
Yes, here in the front. Yes.
Just the opposite.
So Matthew, you've sort of charted the limitations of the declarative mode of speaking in politics, and I was interested in the way in which the deliberative mode, which I think the Women's Coalition pioneered in terms of how we might do politics differently here. But you've all been very eloquent about the power of language and very sceptical about the role of silence, and so I'm wondering, could you speak a little bit if you feel there's any ethical position in remaining silent about some things so that you can open spaces up for other things to be talked about?
I'd be interested to hear Jan's response.
Oh, would you? I might be silent to let other people speak. I guess this is something that I'm thinking about a lot at the minute. So my next book, which is coming out in 4 weeks' time, is very much exploring evangelical Protestantism, which is the culture and community that I grew up in. And I'm thinking a lot about the things, how I say things and how I stay silent on some things in terms of not hurting people that I love. So a lot of what Monica was talking about, it still costs a lot to talk openly in Northern Ireland. And I'm on a journey with a lot of the people in the community that I grew up in, where they're perhaps not as liberal as I would like them to be, but they're definitely more liberal than they were 10, 15 years ago, and more open-minded. And perhaps to challenge them directly on things isn't the right way to get them to continue on that trajectory towards here. So I think sometimes the way we talk to each other in Northern Ireland, we have to think about that a lot as well. That sometimes difficult as it is to hold your tongue and to recognise that you're helping somebody to move in a journey in the right direction, and you're not going to take them right to point Z in this conversation that you're having right now, is quite wise. So I am thinking through all of this on a very personal level at the minute.
It's a brilliant question, and I address it in the book, in the famous Forum for Dialogue and Understanding, which I call the Forum for Monologue and Misunderstanding, because it was a monologue. And I had the personal experience of when we spoke, we were told we were preaching. And when we were silent, we were told, well, it's clear that Women's Coalition have nothing useful to say. Mm-hmm. And in fact, when we were sitting silent, taking in what was being said, so that if we said something, we wanted it to be deliberative and to say it carefully. Mm-hmm. And that is a really good, there's stories I tell in the book that I can tell now and couldn't tell then, because it would have been too difficult. And where we were most reflective and sometimes silent was when we were out of the country. And when Mandela brought us to South Africa, and we brought apartheid to South Africa. Everything was done twice, including Mandela's talks, because the parties wouldn't sit together. Or I should say, Ulster Unionist Party and DUP wouldn't sit with Sinn Féin, who were also in the delegation, who hadn't got a ceasefire, reinstated their ceasefire. But it was a powerful 3 days. And it was a powerful 3 days, and there was a lot of reflection on what the South Africans told us, and we sat and listened. For the first time in our lives, probably. We sat and listened to how others had made their transition. And on the way home, I asked Martin McGuinness what he thought. And he said it was so powerful. And a week later, we had a ceasefire, the reinstatement of the ceasefires. Now, whether it coincided with it or not is only for their organisation to speak about, but I speak about it in terms of the power of sitting listening to others quietly and trying to take home how they did it. Is there anything that we can do? And in fact, we did take quite a bit from South Africa. The sufficiency of consensus concept comes from South Africa. We amended it. But, and you know that, Matthew, that before each sitting of the plenary, there's a couple of minutes silence, which it used to be a prayer, didn't it? And people asked for it to be silence. But honest to God, sometimes I used to think they're sitting there on the edge of their seat waiting to have a go as soon as it's over. Because all hell used to break out in our day. As soon as that was the first assembly, it was a very bitter place to be. You know, I think we did not do enough of that as negotiators. We had no mediators, and we didn't have people taking us out of the room. Well, you know, when you hurt and harm somebody with an insult, and you need to go away somewhere and sit down and have people translate and interpret. We all spoke English, but again, I felt there was an awful lot of interpretation into other English so that people could understand what they were saying. So for all of those things, I think your question's very powerful, is to the power of mediation and the power of sitting reflecting rather than standing up and roaring back at somebody and hurting them. And all we did for a whole year was put the goalposts up higher and higher and higher to make it harder for the other side to get over. So the last 3 days changed everything. And it was the last 3 days where people just really realized as soon as the dominoes were falling, everything began to fall into place. So there was a lot of lessons, and that's what I try to draw out of it.
Do we have another question? Comment? Yeah, head on.
I really liked the idea of transcendence, and I thought it would be interesting to hear more about transcendence and kind of thinking about respecting the detail of the past, but not getting bogged down in it, which is so easy to do, and maybe offering something hopeful, I think, as Susan said, maybe referring to Lyra. So what people think about how writers or creative people can offer something to transcend all of this.
Would anybody like to jump in on that?
I think one thing that's really important, I mean, this isn't, not to get too much into the detail of contemporary policy around legacy because I don't think it's productive, but on, I think you make a really good point around the detail, in a sense, the part of what is missing is a cool and humane, but like detailed, of, you know, authoritative is a contested and contestable word, but accounting of our past in a way that is removed from the day-to-day of everyday political discourse, for example. I mean, I've talked a lot tonight about the limits on everyday political discourse in Northern Ireland, but it is proven beyond, far beyond a reasonable doubt, that our politics cannot cope with or process the past, and in every day, it's just not the place to do it. It doesn't work on the airwaves or in the Assembly. It is not the place to relitigate, or not just to relitigate, but to shed any understanding. And I do think actually writing, and not to use it's Ulster Scots people do think it's, I'm not sure, I think it's actually Hiberno English or Irish, but Plymouth Susan, but the Bear in Mind These Dead is an example of that, of writing doing that, and of humanely allowing people a humane accounting through both, you know, reportage, serious journalism, but also kind of very humane writing, and we do need to see more of it. There's a book which came out, I actually reviewed it. I occasionally review books from Martin at the Irish Times, which I would recommend, which is not a genre which is necessarily particularly sort of common in Irish writing from any part of the island. It slightly reads like true crime at times. It's called An Anatomy of a Killing by Ian Cobain, which came out late last year. I would actually recommend that to people as a cool-headed. It reads a little bit like, and this will sound like it's salacious, it's not. It reads at times a little bit like In Cold Blood by Capote. And that's not to say it's a salacious book. It's a book about the IRA killing of of an RUC man in Lisburn, I think in the very early 80s. And it's excellent, it's cool-headed, it's humane, it has it has context, it has political, sociological, historical context, which is fair-minded and accurately done, and that, in addition to the work of historians like Margaret, is, I think, a way to use popular writing to allow people to access the past, but it does have to be detailed and serious. And I'm sure Mark would probably agree, politicians are not in any way, certainly politicians here, are not in any way equipped to it's not that we're not equipped, we should be equipped to deal with it, as in talk about it responsibly, but we are not equipped to hear, or many politicians are not equipped to handle and help the society process the past.
I was also just going to add, like, I think my first response to what you said as well is just like, is polyphony, is room for all, is like, some people don't want to write about the Troubles, it's okay. Do you know what I mean? Some people will, and will do it really well, and I just think that there's a lot of policing about what you can and can't write about. We all just need to relax a bit. Yeah. You know, I think like there's room for all, and I think that's right. People will always want to write about this place and, you know, Troubles and so on and so forth. And sometimes it's more oblique, sometimes it's in the texture of something and buried and still there. And sometimes there will be a younger generation coming through who just demand to be free. So, you know, I think as
well, Stacey, like that polyphony extends to writing about the Troubles as well. Like, there was something that happened around Milkman and Dairy Girls, which was like, oh, we haven't heard enough of like young women's voices on this period. Mm-hmm. You know, there are queer voices that haven't been heard. There are, you know, environmental takes on what happened in the Troubles. There's so many voices from that period that haven't been heard yet, whether they're retrospective or they lived through it. So I think the polyphony needs to be a polyphonous polyphony.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much for being such a great audience, and thank you so much to the panelists. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you. There's refreshments, there's books for sale. I'm sure the authors would be very happy to sign them for you. And if you'd like to continue the chats, feel free. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Dawn, for organising this.
Thank you.